I'm Ed Steinfeld. I'm the director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. It is my pleasure, truly my pleasure, to welcome you all this morning to the 7th Annual Civilian Military Humanitarian Coordination Research Symposium and Workshop. I look forward to this event every year, and the program just keeps getting better and better, and the kinds of people that we have in the room, it's jaw-dropping to me. I really appreciate your all being here. The importance of this year's theme, adaptive planning and crisis response, opportunities and challenges for civilian military humanitarian coordination in future conflict, it's been unquestionably underscored in recent months by a wide variety of events, the ongoing war in Ukraine and attendant global food issues, human displacement and issues on many borders, not just the US-Mexico border, but including that border, a variety of tensions in East Asia. I can go on and on. Given the state of the world and the state of international relations, it's likely that many, if not most, of future instances of civil-military response to humanitarian crises, whether induced by armed conflict, natural disaster, disease, look, they're going to be influenced by the contending forces of a number of powers capable of projecting power on a regional or global basis, the US, Russia, China, India, but just as important, the extraordinary capabilities of smaller powers that are increasingly playing a major role in the kind of response that we're all involved in. Coordination and deconfliction are already and will continue to be major challenges. Widespread geopolitical friction and contestation just adds another dimension, a set of dimensions to the extraordinarily complex realm in which you're all operating and educating us in the process. I just want to take a moment to underscore just how critical it is for the Watson Institute and really for Brown more broadly, Brown University more broadly, to have the partnership that we do between the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies and the U.S. Naval War College. And that partnership extends beyond the center. It extends to Watson, the Watson Institute, and Brown as a whole. The partnership with the War College has been really critical to everything that we do. It's been critical to our own learning. It's been critical really to our mission. And I especially want to recognize Stephen Mariano, who's here today. Stephen is the provost of the U.S. Naval War College, and my colleague. We at Watson believe that to understand human security, one has to understand the full range of roles played by the armed forces, not just in national defense, although that's obviously critical, but also in humanitarian response, climate remediation, and through effective civil-military relations, governance, frankly. Our interactions with practitioners, like many of you, and with our colleagues at the Naval War College and our colleagues here at the Watson Military Fellows Program, a number of fellows are represented here, those interactions are profoundly important for our research, for our teaching, for our mission more broadly. Basically, I believe that this relationship, the kind of relationships that we have, not just with the War College, but with many of you who are practitioners and scholars and doers, it goes to the heart of our mission, but the educational enterprise more broadly that we're all engaged in. I'm grateful to all of you, really, for participating in the symposium today and tomorrow, Wednesday, and more fundamentally, I'm grateful to all of you for educating us and for sharing your wisdom. I hope we're able to give something back in return. I know there'll be a lot of mutual learning and collaboration over the next few days, and I'm confident, I say this both as a request, but also I know it's going to happen, that we'll continue learning from each other and with each other for many more years to come. With that, I'd like to turn over the floor to Adam Levine, who is the director of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies and also a professor here at Brown. Adam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome today. On behalf of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies here at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs, and on behalf of our other sponsors for this research symposium, the Civilian Military Humanitarian Response Program within the College of Maritime Operational Warfare at the U.S. Naval War College, the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs Civil Military Coordination Service, and the United Nations World Food Program, we are very pleased to welcome you here to what is our 7th annual workshop on civil-military humanitarian coordination, and our third annual research symposium. Thank you for coming from all over the world. Many of you had very long flights, I know, to get here. Some of you came from closer at hand. Either way, we're really delighted to have such an incredibly diverse and exceptional crowd of people here in the room. So our research symposium today will feature 10 different oral presentations, as well as over a dozen poster presentations, making it our largest research symposium ever, and to my knowledge, probably one of the largest research symposiums on civil-military humanitarian coordination in the world. So we're really delighted to have so many excellent researchers who will be presenting their empirical work and case studies from around the world, and I hope that you will enjoy it. We're going to begin, just after I finish speaking, with our feature presentation titled Afghan Evacuee Experiences of Operation Allies Refuge and Operation Allies Welcome. And I will ask our panelists now to come up for that. Firstly, Dr. Alexandria Nylen, Research Associate with our own Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies. Jonathan Bott, who is one of the military fellows here at the Watson Institute Military Fellows Program that Ed Steinfeld just mentioned, and also a practitioner with the U.S. military that was involved in Operation Allies Welcome. We also have Omar Ba, Dr. Omar Ba, the director of the Refugee Dream Center here in Providence, who's worked with a number of different refugee communities here in the United States. And finally, Mr. Noorulhaq Sadeqi, who is himself an Afghan refugee who came as part of Operation Allies Refuge and Operation Allies Welcome, and will present a very unique perspective on what is now officially the largest humanitarian evacuation organized by the U.S. government in history. After this presentation, in which we'll also have some great time for discussion, so hopefully all of you will have questions, we will then have poster presentations and lunch. So lunch will be from 12 o'clock to 1:30 or 13:30 for those on military time. And we gave you an extra long lunch period specifically because we're going to have over a dozen posters that will be lined up right here outside this room. I really want to encourage everyone to take the time sometime during lunch to go visit all of the posters, to read about their unique research, and to hopefully engage with some of the presenters who will be presenting their research at the posters. After that, we will be breaking into 3 separate panels. We have so much research, we couldn't fit it all into one day, and if we had tried, you guys would be very mad at me because it would be a very long day. So instead, we're going to have one panel here in this room, which will be contemporary challenges in civilian-military interactions. We'll have a second panel on civilian-military interactions in the age of environmental hazards and climate change, which will be just across Star Plaza here in the main Watson building on the 3rd floor in the McKinney Conference Room. And then finally, we'll have a panel on civilian-military interactions during public health emergencies like pandemics and epidemics. And that will be also right across Star Plaza in the main Watson building on the 1st floor in the Joukowsky Forum. So decide before the end of lunch which of these you want to go to, and hopefully we'll have a relatively even distribution across them, and you'll get to hear in each of those panels 3 separate research presentations. For those of you who are joining us online through the live stream, I just want to let you know that we will be live streaming all 3 panels simultaneously. And so you can go to watson.brown.edu/CHRHS, click on our link for the research symposium, and you can get the links for each of the different panels to attend, whichever one you would like. And after those panels, that will be the end of our research symposium, and we'll invite everybody who's here in person to come back to the Agora right here outside of this room, where we'll have a very nice reception. And that will go from 15:45 or 3:45 until 1700 or 5 o'clock. At that time, the vans will depart for the Graduate Hotel for those who want to take the van back to their hotel, but you're also welcome to hang out here and keep chatting until you go off to dinner. I would like to say, though, that the vans will be departing the Graduate Hotel tomorrow at 7:45 a.m. sharp, so a bit earlier of a start time tomorrow. So please, everyone, make sure that you are downstairs and at the van at 7:45 a.m. so we can have a on-time start tomorrow for our workshop. And the research symposium is completely open to the public. So definitely encourage all of you, feel free to tweet it out, including you can tweet out the links to the live stream for any people who want to watch it. It will be recorded as well, but tomorrow's workshop will be closed to the public, and we'll have some more information at the beginning of the workshop about how that will work and the rules around talking about what happens at the workshop. Finally, before I conclude, I want to give a special thanks to some of our funders, including the R. Dudley Harrington Jr. Charitable Foundation, the Wigion Foundation, the U.S. Naval War College Foundation, and the UN World Food Program. We thank you for your generous support for our workshop this year, which has allowed us to especially support bringing individuals from across the world here for this workshop so that they can represent and present as well. So thank you, and without any further ado, I will turn it over to Alexandria and our panel for our very first research presentation.
Thank you so much, Adam. Welcome, everyone. It's so great to see everyone in person and put faces to emails. You've received a lot of emails from me, so it's wonderful to meet you in person and to see some of you again. Again, I'm Alexandria Nylen. I'm the Civil Military Program Research Associate at CHRHS. And a key part of the goal of the CivMil program is to make our evidence-based academic work practical and user-friendly. This is especially true in the case of this current research project that we are presenting on today, which aims to have programmatic policy and academic relevance. So the evacuation of more than 100,000 Afghan citizens from Kabul last year was the largest humanitarian evacuation in recent memory. It's vital that we learn about the successes and the challenges of this evacuation from the perspectives of the Afghan evacuees themselves in order to improve similar humanitarian evacuations in the future, as well as aid in the smooth resettlement of current Afghan evacuees. So this project has two goals. One is to assess the Afghan evacuees' immediate needs. We want to know what kinds of goods, services, and support this newly arrived community needs so we can help them feel more at home and integrated in Rhode Island. And the other is to document their experiences working in Afghanistan with the U.S. military or government partners, as well as their experiences of the U.S.-led evacuation and resettlement. So this report draws on 32 interviews with Afghan evacuees who experienced both Operation Allies Refuge, so the airlift from Kabul, and Operations Allies Welcome, so the domestic resettlement operation inside the U.S. And so these evacuees who experienced these two operations and who have resettled in Providence, Rhode Island. So this sample is representative of three broad categories of evacuees. So the first are special immigrant visa holders, so SIV. The second are SIV eligible participants or parolees. And the third are non-SIV eligible parolees. So both those two latter categories are under humanitarian parole in the US, except the non-SIV eligible parolees are not eligible to receive an SIV and permanent residence. So in addition to the interviews, the data collection for this report also included the use of clinically validated mental health screeners with a subset of participants who were willing to participate in this part of the research. So we, of course, adhered to the strictest ethical standards of social science research for this project. Consent scripts were read in the language of the participants choosing at the beginning. No paper consent forms were collected. We got IRB exemption for that. And interviews were de-identified and confidential. So we partnered with the Refugee Dream Center to conduct the interviews with the Afghan evacuees resettling in Rhode Island, and you'll hear a little bit more about the Refugee Dream Center's work later on. The data for this project was collected in Providence over the course, or over the period of October 2021, so very shortly after the evacuation, to August 2022. We used a grounded approach to social science inquiry in order to analyze these transcripts. So this means we go into the analysis with as few preconceived notions as possible, so without a rigid analytical method, in order to let the key themes emerge from the interview data themselves. So we did this by qualitatively coding the interview transcripts in a qualitative coding software called NVivo. The authors also want to add a note of methodological caution regarding the nature of interviews for social science data. So any data based on interviews must be understood as imperfect information. So the researchers, for example, have no way of telling if the statements are true reflections of the individual's perceptions or merely a framing that they're presenting to the researcher. Either way, we think it's important. We also want to acknowledge that there is a large social desirability factor that in asking recent evacuees about their perceptions of the government that evacuated them from, and in many cases, were their former employer and that they're looking for resettlement through. So we just want to acknowledge that. So let's get into the interesting part. So this research report that the research is based on presents its findings in a chronological order across the individual's experiences working with the U.S. and Afghanistan, and then the two operations covering topics such as risks and rewards of working with the U.S., the chaos at the Kabul airport during the evacuation, during the airlift, and the uncertainty of living in international and U.S. staging bases, waiting for processing. It also covers familial separation and hopes for the future. So I will talk about a selection of these themes today, but I encourage everyone who hasn't already to read the report to be able to see all of the themes we uncovered. So the first theme that I'll talk about is around family. Family was by far the largest cluster, and it dealt with topics of separation and ongoing financial considerations and obligations, and also concern over physical safety of loved ones who are left behind in Afghanistan. A key theme to arise across almost every interview was family separation. So interviewees reported being separated from their families in a variety of ways. So some described being separated from family members at the actual airport, while others left for the airport themselves and left family at home. Many military personnel, so Afghan National Army personnel, did not get the chance to take eligible family members along with them due to the short time frame that they were alerted. Researchers were told several stories about families being separated at the airport. So one interviewee who made it to the tarmac of the Kabul airport with their sibling described how their sibling had second thoughts of leaving family behind in Afghanistan, and even though they themselves were eligible for evacuation, they made a snap decision to return home and not be evacuated. Another interviewee described going to the airport with a sibling, but getting separated after the Abbey Gate bombing, the terrorist attack that occurred at the airport, and their family members got separated. So one part of the family ended up on the side behind the gate, and then they ended up on the side on the tarmac. So they got separated, and their other family members weren't able to join them. So many describe concerns about family safety as an overriding concern about their resettlement in the US and family reunification. One person stated that it would be, quote, everything for me if they could bring their family members to the US. Another described the inability of feeling resettled and safe themselves in the US until they are reunited with their pregnant spouse who is left behind in Afghanistan. Another theme was chaos and uncertainty, the feelings of chaos and uncertainty at the Kabul airport. So the lead up to the US evacuation was urgent. Thus, it makes sense that nearly every interviewee we spoke with described traumatic experiences of the evacuation, both in terms of how they learned about their eligibility to be evacuated and the actual airlift operation at the airport. So conversations with interviewees reflected disbelief at the pace in which the country fell to the Taliban. One individual who worked at the US Embassy in administration described their shock and unwillingness to believe that Kabul could fall, even when the Taliban forces were 2 hours away from the capital. This perception of shock and surprise, of course, varies across urban-rural divides. Folks who lived in more rural areas were less surprised that the Taliban was resurgent and as powerful as it was. So leading up to the US evacuation, some participants reported that they were given little information about if they were eligible. So many reported that they were notified with a moment's notice when it was time to leave the country. Once notified, they were forced to quickly gather their belongings and make their way to the airport. And this resulted in some cases that participants were either not able to bring family members along because they were either too sick to travel or they were not considered eligible as dependents for SIV visas or SIVs. Many of those who were eligible for SIVs even had been left behind as well. Estimates put these numbers between 70,000 and 100,000 people who were eligible for SIVs who were left behind. One of our interviewees, a soldier from the Afghan army, actually described fighting with his unit all the way to the airport and then guarding the airport for 7 days and then being evacuated himself. This individual reports not understanding that he was actually to be evacuated himself at the end of his guard duty, so he didn't have time to bring his family. This chaos reportedly led to a level of informality within the operation. So, for example, having an individual connection with someone who worked either in the embassy or the military often helped expedite the notification and evacuation process. There are several examples of U.S. military service people going above and beyond to help individual Afghans they fought alongside get out of the country. Additionally, some interviews reported that it was only at the discretion and humanity of individual U.S. service personnel that allowed many civilians to gain access to the Kabul airport who were not actually eligible. So seeing the human effects of lacking an exit plan reportedly led to individual acts of compassion on the part of U.S. service members. This helped more civilians gain access to the airport, but it also simultaneously created an even more chaotic situation on the ground. So another key theme is differentiated experiences between men and women evacuees. So the experience of male and female evacuees varied drastically at every stage of both operations. So first, there's the most basic question of who is and who isn't left behind. and the consequences of being left behind. So in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, we've seen a rollback in women's rights to work and go to school. Several interviewees described great anxiety over the fate of female family members who were left behind, either because they were ineligible for a visa or they were unable to get to the airport on time. Some report that their teenage daughters who had previously been attending school and envisioning a path to university no longer see a future for themselves. Others described a dangerous environment at the Kabul airport, and which created all kinds of protection issues towards women. The perceived danger of a largely male-occupied and militarized space at the Kabul airport actually led some individuals that we spoke to leave eligible female family members behind and not to evacuate them. And so second and relatedly, there's also the question of agency. So as discussed earlier, only individuals eligible for an SIV and their immediate family members were supposed to be evacuated. So few women worked for the US military in Afghanistan, and men eligible for evacuation were allowed to bring immediate family members with them. So this means that even in cases where women and girls were evacuated and were eligible, they were in large part brought along as dependents and not the primary applicant. So women's literacy rates and ability to speak a second language are much lower than men's at a rate of 23% to 52%. So this means that the burden of resettlement in the US is especially difficult for women. So these findings are, of course, not particularly surprising. As we know from other cases, women and girls are particularly vulnerable at every stage of a humanitarian disaster. However, this data does contribute to a growing body of evidence that calls for a more gendered approach to studying civil-military interaction. So the final theme that I'll talk about today has to do with resettlement in Rhode Island and family reunification. So once in Rhode Island, participants described overall positive experiences with organizations like the Refugee Dream Center, Dorcas International, and the resettlement bases that you're about to hear about. So most participants now live in apartments with their family members, and they were placed with other newly arrived Afghans who traveled to the US or alone. When asked about concerns about resettlement in Rhode Island, participants mainly expressed stress about bringing family members who were left behind to the US. As such, participants are working with RDC or seeking legal counsel to aid in family reunification. In one instance, a participant described having to leave her eldest daughter behind because she had recently gotten married, and she was expected to stay at home with her husband and his family. In another instance, a participant described having to leave his wife and child behind because they were too sick to travel. So these individuals keenly want to bring these individuals over. Regarding participants' aspirations for the future, most participants would like to either work or further their education, many of whom had their educational programs interrupted by the fall of Kabul. Participants described wanting to buy their own homes and wanting to help other Afghans resettle in the US. So from this data, we came up with some recommendations. So the first recommendation is to address the disparities in the populations who are eligible for evacuation. So the US SIV policy needs sustainable and effective definitions that cover all categories of potentially eligible individuals and their families. The framework should include considerations of non-Euro-American family structures to guide future efforts and to educate folks working for the US government. So for example, the concept of an immediate family, so the idea that only your spouse and children would be able to come did not translate in the Afghan context, in which many people live in a multi-generational household. So it would be inconceivable to leave behind, for example, a parent, a grandparent. So revisiting the definitions. The second recommendation is to involve displaced populations awaiting resettlement in decision-making processes. So a framework for communication that gives agency to displaced populations awaiting resettlement in order to help identify needs and address issues faced by the evacuees is essential. So any a repeatable template for dialogue should include stakeholder selection considerations to engender trust and build understanding with the community. Furthermore, a combined review board to methodology to applicable stakeholders together to address requirements and spending strategy creates an opportunity to combine resources, accountability, and decrease wasteful overlap. So the third, provide better education and expectation management for civilian military coordination throughout interaction, exercise, and preparation. So exercise and coordination frameworks between military, civilian, government, and non-governmental organizations will lead to better education for all involved and can improve the speed and effectiveness of response to emergencies. And so the use of non-conflict scenarios in response to environmental or technical disasters would improve civil communication while protecting the principles established in humanitarian law. So the fourth recommendation is to further develop interagency and NGO coordination frameworks. So the UCG framework should be expanded to include optional incorporation of NGOs and other non-state actors, such as specialized volunteers using practices from UN frameworks, such as the Interagency Standing Committee. Templates for coordination may include memorandums of understanding for areas such as information sharing, licenses, law enforcement, funding, and reimbursement. And this is particularly in response to the Operation Allies Welcome, so the resettlement operations in the US that you're about to hear more about. So 5, redouble efforts to integrate gender into refugee resettlement considerations. So as you heard earlier, gender was one of the largest themes next to family separation to come out of these interviews. So resettlement and post-resettlement organizations should continue integrating socialization initiatives and for women to address culturally sensitive gender roles and differences in the US. A staged consensus building community-based program should focus on communication pathways, reduce isolation that female participants were describing, and use relationships to educate and help out the community. So the 6th recommendation is to create a centralized and easily accessible information portal to address key resettlement concerns and needs of all Afghan evacuees. So this includes education and immigration information. So many of the issues that evacuees described as being confusing to them the information can be found online, but just very piecemeal. So what would be helpful would be a language accessible portal so that people can access it and get timely information all in one place. To address the economic hardships that we learned about in the interviews, we suggest hosting a refugee-centered job fairs with local businesses and getting the Chamber of Commerce involved to help these folks who come with very specialized skill sets get jobs that match those skill sets. And then lastly, integrate culturally sensitive mental health care into refugee health care. So this comes out of the mental health screener data, but also the interview data and the need to integrate more culturally and linguistically tailored mental health resources, perhaps through a more informal approach that is deeply enmeshed within the community, and also perhaps catching people when they're being when they do intakes into the emergency room. So those are the recommendations our report puts forth. We, of course, elaborate on them in the actual report. And I am happy to now hand the presentation over to my colleague, Jonathan. And thank you for your time. You could bring that up if you want. I'll just plug this in so it doesn't run out.
While she's plugging in the computer so that something awful doesn't happen where you can't see any pictures and you only have to listen to me, my presentation, and I think each of us are going to aim to only be about 10 to 12 minutes long, and that's only to give you a teaser trailer of all of the information that's available inside of this report and hopefully out of the discussions. And why is that? Well, one, I just found out at the beginning of this that my new boss next year is here as I go to teach at the Naval War College, and I am dependent upon your questions to make me look good, okay? So we'll leave a lot of time for that. Second, there's a plethora of information out there, and we need to talk about the things that matter to you, right? I would offer that not only the report, which is available online, and I really encourage you to at least read the executive summary. Come on, a lot of good work went into that. But Watson also has a podcast, trending globally, and last October or so did a great series on this particular issue. Omar was interviewed for that, and he sounds spectacular, right? So that's why they had me go first, because he's going to impress you. And finally, I gave an hour-long talk, if you're concerned about the context that was happening, called Wings of Hope, and it's available on Watson's YouTube channel. So I reference you to all those things if you care more about us speaking, but I care about what you care about. So here's a couple of teaser trailers. I'm going to talk to you about the context briefly. It matters. But then I'm going to talk to you about an education gap. That matters to all of us. And lastly, I'm going to talk to you about a coordination gap, because that matters to all of us. All right, so the context. This picture is fairly famous. That is Reach 871, a C-17 cargo aircraft out of Kabul on August 16th, 2021. I want you to close your eyes for a minute. Unless you're concerned that the caffeine hasn't kicked in, then please don't. And I want you to imagine that you're part of a 4-person crew of that Reach 871. And in the back of their aircraft is a bunch of military equipment that they're loading in order to remove it from Afghanistan, because that was their mission that day. And instead, the airport at Kabul, the security around that airport, fell. And thousands and thousands of people are streaming toward their aircraft with a big American flag on the outside of it. Many of them started to board the aircraft. And that crew had to make a decision at that moment. Do they wait on the ground and see what happens when security is re-maintained, or so on and so forth? 2, do they try to push these 4 individuals, the 100 or so folks that are entering their aircraft, off so they can take off immediately? Or 3, do they push all this equipment off their aircraft and do what is not in doctrine and is not in their training, and do the best they can with the assets they have available to help as many people as they safely think possible? They did not receive any direction, but instead they did the last thing and the most important thing. Not being trained for this, they did the best they could. And that was 823 people that were removed from a very tough situation. I tell you that story because it's important to realize the vast majority of military members who are engaged in disaster relief or humanitarian response are not trained specifically for humanitarian relief and disaster response. Good things can come of it. That's a picture of a lily pad location that you see in the bottom right, if I did my right-left correct. So that was an international location that we temporarily housed many of the evacuees. There was over 40 nations, allies and partners, that volunteered specifically to open their doors and help with this evacuation operation. Primarily the U.S. Air Force, although others helped, got nearly, depends on how you count this, 128,000 people, we'll just say. Some people removed the U.S. citizens from that, out of Afghanistan in about 2 weeks worth of time. First to lily pad locations, and then to 8 sites within the United States, which we call safe havens. Go to the YouTube video if you want a whole bunch more information on that. Or the report, which we talk a lot about it.
why am I up here in front of you? I'm a fighter guy. I spent 2 decades learning how to fly fighters and fight and break things. I was not someone that was trained in order to do this, but instead I was called to be a chief of staff at one of those 8 locations within the United States, safe havens. This case, New Mexico. Giving you some pictures up there. The top left picture is essentially what it looked like on day 1. And you can see it's just an open desert environment. The bottom picture is what it looked like about a week in, and in between, we did the best we could. I mention this because I want you to look at this timeline. We were training in order to do peer conflict or deter, in this particular case, Russia. We were going to take members of our organization in North Carolina, which is not New Mexico for those who do not study geography, and we were going to go to Europe. And we were going to use skills that we were developing in order to best be able to fight and win wars against a peer competitor. And on the 25th of August, Tuesday, we got a phone call that said, hey, you know those skills that you guys are experimenting with? We might need you to go to New Mexico and help with an Afghan evacuation. We said, what? I didn't even know an evacuation was going on at this time, and I'm being 100% honest with you. I was focused on something completely different. Wednesday, we got another phone call that said, yep, you know that heads up phone call we said? Yeah, we actually mean it. You should go. And so we sent 50 personnel out to New Mexico, and we found that first picture I showed you. The next day, about 250 folks flew, so Friday, out to New Mexico, and we started working very hard at creating infrastructure and a location to house. I want to paint that picture of a timing because on Monday morning, we received our first 136 evacuees off the back of a C-130 from Afghanistan via a lily pad location in Dulles. Most of the people that were helping us, the task force members, about 500 of the 850 folks, literally got on a bus out of basic military training, drove from San Antonio to New Mexico, and got off a bus, having just graduated high school 3 months before, and said, I'm here to help. And we put them to work. That is supposed to give you good feelings about the capability and possibilities that are there within the military environment. We can create infrastructure. We have experts that are really good at engineering. But you know what we're really terrible at? All the people fuzzy things, the cultural things, the coordination with anyone outside of the DoD, right? And that's going to come into play here and why I'm in an education gap. Because it's not that we didn't have other organizations that were helping us. We had 19 at my particular location, it varies by location, 19 interagency and NGO organizations that were there helping us within about 48 hours of those first arrivals. At least one representative. But I'm going to give you a little story, because first day, before those arrivals showed up, 186,000 pounds of relief supplies were delivered by the American Red Cross on the back of trailers. 1 week later, 186,000 pounds of relief supplies were still sitting on the back of trailers. Why? Because we didn't know how to work with each other. The military members, who were focused on completely different things, were worried about posse comitatus, worried about last resort, about what it looks like if we were doing anything to take relief supplies and physically hand those out. The NGOs that we're working with had a misconception, and I mean this in all honesty, it was not, the individual workers with the NGOs that were there had a misconception about what last resort principles mean. There is an education gap for both of us. You're the smartest people in the room on both the military and the NGO sides, and I'll tell you, if you're honest with yourself, many of you probably read that once and were like, okay, great, it's in my education, and probably don't reference it again. I didn't know, for instance, and I was one of the people in charge, that last resort principles do not apply when it comes to defense assets operating on their own sovereign soil. That would have been great if somebody pointed that out. I also didn't know that when I was working for a National Guardsman under a different title of the US Code, I'm following his orders, doing things that I'm allowed to operate within the US soil. So a bunch more opportunities there. We could have provided those supplies a lot faster than we did. It works both ways. Now, last small anecdote that I want to share has to do with the physical coordination between, I'll go back to this picture, you can see those in a minute, the physical coordination and frameworks that we use, both interagency and NGO with the military. We've developed the UCG, which was referenced earlier, and it's outstanding. It is a lot better than it used to be. And if you look back to disaster response in history, we've done better. But when you look, Appendix 3, I recommend it, it's a great picture, at the structure, it does not follow the function that we need it to do. Because there are organizations that want to help, and yet we don't give them the opportunity to communicate and understand the full subset of the problem because we don't have a way of coordinating with non-governmental organizations or those very well-trained volunteers that want to be there, like the medical personnel that showed up to our location and said, I'm a doctor, I'm here to help, but I'm a doctor in Texas, so how does it that what allows me to practice medicine on this federal installation in New Mexico under where authority? Well, we don't know. And so we can do better, and I will offer that Alexandria did a great job mentioning, some of the ways that we talked about that. There are lessons learned in the international community, UN cluster approaches, the IASC, like that we can take those lessons and adopt them appropriately for our own CivMil coordination. I'll end here. Our last problem, and the greatest, embarrassing, is trust. And that extends between those evacuees that we were attempting to help and between our organizations. The solution for that problem is relationships and practice. And in so doing, we fix those other two problems of education and coordination gaps as well. You, if you're a humanitarian organization, should care what military organizations are operating in the same spaces that you are. And if you're a military member, you should care who is operating in your area of responsibility when you're deployed someplace. And I shouldn't just depend on the people that are specifically trained to build a relationship with all these different entities across a global environment. Instead, when military organizations, for instance, are going to operate inside of a theater, we should at least have a conversation about it. The civil organizations get to learn the capabilities in case a disaster hits. And now we have capabilities that we can call upon as a last resort because they can fill the gap. The military members get to know who to call when they're told, go help. We build a relationship through giving agency to those that we're asked to help and those that we're helping with. And there's a great example we talk about in the report about giving everyone a voice at a table to understand what we're bringing and what the context of what they're fighting is. That's your teaser to go read the report. If you care about improving disaster relief and humanitarian response, then I would say we cannot wait for that disaster to happen for us to build better templates and better trust now. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. That was really great. My name is Omar Ba. I'm the founder of the Refugee Dream Center based here in Providence, Rhode Island. And I'm also a former refugee from the Gambia in West Africa, a former reporter. But I just want to start by thanking Professor Adam, because without his foresight and vision, this whole thing wouldn't have happened. Because when we started talking about this research project, by the way, I think something disappeared.
Help is coming.
Well, while Alexandra is doing that, actually, I'll come this side, so I'll get the mic.
There you go.
While Alexandra is doing that, I want to acknowledge the presence of Baha Sadr, who is the state refugee coordinator, who, out of his busy schedule, was able to make it here today for the state of Rhode Island, and Adeline, who is the state health coordinator. I succeeded in bringing both of them here because it's really important to have them hear some of these recommendations, but also to see how we can all have a conversation around doing better services here in Rhode Island. Brown will fix this thing very soon. Great. Great. Well, thank you so much, Alexandra, for rescuing that quick disaster. Well, I reached out to Adam just a little bit after the evacuation started and all these things happening. And my curiosity was around what we should do, what should happen in the United States, because everybody was talking about, the whole world was talking about evacuations, refugees being evacuated from Afghanistan, from going to different parts and then coming to military bases. But what would happen, because eventually 1 year, 2 years, 3 years down the line, everybody will forget about them. Or if not, the honeymoon will be over. And that is where, personally, I was more concerned, because we'll be left with the debris of all the challenges that happen. And people certainly are familiar with immigration, what that means, when people come to this country. I'm sorry you guys have some people from outside this country, but I'll be talking mostly in the context of the US, refugees in the US, evacuees in the US, people coming here. But the theme and the idea would be very similar. But immigrants coming here, and refugees and asylum seekers, even SIVs, these are very familiar terms here in the US. And what we did not know was, one, these people coming from Afghanistan, what were they? How can you help somebody you don't even know how to call them, the name? I reached out to a friend at the Department of Justice and said, what the heck are these people? Who are they? What are we going to even call them? She did not know. And this is an official of the US government. She had no idea. She said, let me find out and get back to you. She returned my call later in the day and said, they're going to be called parolees. I said, okay. The only time I hear that term is when people are coming out of prison, right? So this is going to be a problem. That term alone is stigmatizing. It carries some stigma with it. People are not coming out of prison. But that was like the literal thought that comes out of it immediately, humanitarian parolees and parolees. Okay, at least there's a framing and naming around it. Then what happens next? After all, again, as I indicated, after all that hype is over, what happens after the honeymoon period? What do we do here within our state and local communities, and who does what? In Rhode Island, the service is very small. It's 2 major resettlement agencies that receive refugees from the federal government, and they operate on a literally very rushed process, because sometimes it's 90 days. Within the 90 days, you have to have almost everything ready. And then we have people sitting here, including my colleague here, 2 years down the line, he hasn't gotten even his asylum. He will talk more about it. Families are separated. What you think that can happen within 90 days, and that is where our problem happened. That was most of the issue, and then I reached out to Adam. I said, let's do some research around this, because otherwise, everybody will be guessing. And this is not like the usual resettlement process. The US government agents, Homeland Security agents going to a refugee camp, processing with their nice suits, processing people, fingerprint and everything, then flying refugees here to be resettled is different. Nobody knows what this is, so we must have a better process than not just guessing. And until then, everything we were doing, we were just guessing. And I think This is the typical journey of a refugee that we see. I mean, a lot of people are from the international world. You see some of this stuff. And these are refugees crossing, Syrian refugees crossing to the Greek islands. And that, it's a horrible sight, but we are familiar with this kind, unlike the Afghan evacuations. This is a typical UN refugee camp. And probably what we don't often see is this, not too common because the media may not show us this that much, but this is how most refugees live. It's not this. This because people come in and then set up tents and live anyhow they want. It's a very difficult journey. Most refugees live in these spaces for years, some 10, 15 years. I was in Ghana at a refugee camp, and I was sick for a whole week, for a whole year that I was there, only 1 year, but I used to ask myself questions, how people survived these 10, 15 years. Many people were from Liberia, Ivory Coast, and they survived it 10, 15 years. 1 year I was almost getting out of this space. I couldn't do it because there's always that dysentery, always outbreaks of diseases, safety is a problem, and then the environment, sometimes coughing, it's a lot of problems that happen there. Imagine this building, beyond the horizon, you can see a beautiful city there, but people are literally almost concentrated in certain places and quarantined from integrating with the public. And now what I wanted to converge as the Refugee Dream Center, actually at the Refugee Dream Center, what we do is we look at gaps. We also continue services for as long as people need them from a community perspective. Like basically looking at things from beyond the 90 days or beyond the 6 months, beyond the first year, what happens really after and at community level when probably everybody is almost forgotten, what happens. And so what we do is we look at gaps that exist. Sometimes it's just transportation or language. We have caseworkers from almost every ethnicity. And then we also continue services for as long as people need them. Sometimes somebody disappears 5 years down the line, it's time to be a citizen. They come back again because the test is hard. You have to prepare for the citizenship test. So basically being there from a community perspective as a refugee self-help program. And we know when people come in, there are risk factors. Sometimes there is limited support system. Even if all these services are available, the support system may be limited. There is also frustrated expectations. This is even more real for people who are just evacuated and then dropped to the United States. You expect, when a refugee is coming to the US, this is across the board. This is, you expect you're going to the top of Sugar Candy Mountain where rivers are flowing with milk and honey, and you're plugging money from the trees, right? Like the US, that's the typical story that people think of the US. Certainly it's better than what you left, where this war and conflict and probably extreme levels of poverty, but you are not plugging money from the trees. You are not gonna be sending money how you want to your family back home. And you are not going to have a chauffeur, a driver, an SUV. The one that the Secret Service drives is suburban, right? You are not going to have a suburban with a driver outside your house. And you are not, it's going to be under swimming pool. So it's going to be expectations that are frustrated because you don't have what you are thinking of the US. So then that is where it's difficult to adapt. And you're talking about 2 years, 3 years. It's a lifetime. You are not going anywhere. You are part of the United States. And some of the challenges, many challenges are language. How do we address challenges? We have people at our classes at the Refugee Dream Center still attending classes. They've been here for years. They're still learning how to get functional English so that they can just get around, get into the US to go to the store, to take the bus, to get a job. They can just be conversational. Some of it is lack of efficient means of transportation. In most countries, people don't drive. Owning a car actually is a luxury. You don't drive. The economic stressors. Sometimes you are a nurse. You come in here. They say, "Oh, you have to go to school to be a nurse again." You are a doctor. You have to go to school for 4 years again to practice medicine, and you don't have time for that. You don't want to do that. There's also something around stigma. If you are a military general and you drive around with a motorcade of 2 vehicles with bodyguards, you're not going to stand in front of the hospital and say, "Oh, you have to get a job," and then be a security guard in front of the hospital. It carries stigma. You don't want even people who know you to see you doing that. So those are some of the challenges that we see. But the biggest problem is culture shock and culture clash. Good examples. One, culture shock would be, let me see. For instance, you meet with an American, a caseworker coming to your house, and then with their dog. Oh, it's a service dog, I have to come with my dog. They enter your house. You come into an Afghan family's house with that dog, you already have a cultural clash. It's not gonna work. Because for you as an American, it's your child, the dog is your child, and an Afghan or a Gambian somebody, it is a bodyguard or a hunter. So those are the two differences. So, and then sometimes it's just like waving with the left hand. So culture clashes happen. And then we started guessing by observation at the Refugee Dream Center. Before even all the interviews, Alexandria started even giving preliminary reports of the themes she was seeing. What we started seeing was like the gender, that became one of the biggest things that, based on observation, we already launched a program called the Afghani Women's Project. And we were lucky to have the funding from one of our funders to start that project, because we realized many women were not coming out. They were just at home. And then when you come to the house, you have dinner with the husband and the children, the wife will be inside the bedroom. So you don't actually even see them. So imagine, the idea of women must go to work, women must drive. Those are all cultural clashes that you needed a lot of negotiation and partnership and allies with the husbands to manage, what is legal, what is not, but where you are not disrespecting somebody's culture. It's a lot of navigation and alignment and realignment that needed to happen so that we are all on the same page, because the idea is to successfully integrate into American society. And again, to commend Adam for this study, because I don't think, to our search, I don't think this kind of study has happened anywhere in the US so far, and probably even others across the world can learn from it, those who are engaged in resettlement. So we started some of these programs, cultural awareness, where we'll just bring refugees into the center and start talking about refugee culture. We used to call it cultural competency, and Baha will agree with me. I don't like those terms, cultural competency, cultural orientation, because I think they have different connotations. I call it cultural awareness training. Both what Americans who are serving you should understand, and you should understand in American culture, so that you can at least navigate and settle down. And by the way, we work with all refugee ethnicities, people from Congo, Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, literally Haiti, literally from across the board, so that people who do not get the services at this moment, or need extra services or extended services, are coming there to find those services. Between our board and staff, we have another group of 8 community leaders. Between all these different structures, we have 37 languages spoken. So basically, there's always somebody who can speak a language. There's somebody who speaks 5 languages. I think I'm one of them. I may have lost one, but 4.5. And there's somebody who speaks 7 languages. So we have 37 languages, and I think that's one of the biggest assets that we have. Sometimes it's not really just teaching somebody English or taking them to a job site or helping them with legal immigration work, sending them to a lawyer. It's beyond that. It's the personal accompaniment and the cultural accompaniment that matters. This is a job club where people are, actually it's part of the cultural training. This is like, you can see, one thing that you can see is most are men. Where are the women? There are women too, but they're mostly at home, and that's where we started having issues. And we started launching these programs before, because we were still starting to see themes that we think we can guess to start working on, but it's not perfect. Then we have youth mentoring, where we're bringing refugee youth and Afghani youth and other youth from other communities, so that we can integrate them, put them together to start understanding American culture. But we were lucky to have a stipend program from the state through Baha's office to start giving these kids stipends so that they can get out and start integrating with other refugee kids. And we also have this is the women's program, actually, where the women would come in, and a job club where people will learn how to do interviews, and some of them started getting jobs. Edisa is one of the biggest employers of refugees here. And then the women's group is when we started building allies with the refugee women and their husbands to make sure that they come out and get them into jobs and do different activities. And then just finally, we do food supplies and home visits, basically just connecting and building that trust that Jonathan was talking about. I think at the local level, that trust is also very important. And those are some of our caseworkers. And on that note, I welcome Sadeqi to come to the stage. Thank you.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much. You gave me this chance. I'm really feeling glad to meet all of you guys in the one room. My name is Noorulhaq. My last name is Sadeqi. I was a military pilot in Afghanistan. To be honest, as a military pilot, as this great man, he explained the experience of military. I want to add something. In the military, we have a lot of limitation, a lot of procedure for safety, for standard. We have a lot of things. To be honest, flying is a kind of different job for we have to be very careful about that. It's very easy, the emergency is happening during the flight. Until 15th of August of 2021, personally, I was never expecting to be a refugee or something happening like this in my country. I was decided to serve for my country, for my nation, for freedom of my nation and the women's right and democracy in Afghanistan until I died, to be honest. It was my decision before that. But right now, according to that experience, I am expecting that for myself and also for other people. In the meantime, we are trying our best. We should try our best, but we should expect the worst. The worst thing is coming. Like this, it's happening in Afghanistan. The day I was there, I decided it was a rumor between the Air Force. But something is happening. I was in a north part of Afghanistan. I saw 2-3 provinces in front of my eyes during my mission. They fell. As a military personnel, I was decided we are fighting. We have system, we have government, the American troops are here. Nothing will happen like this suddenly in 1 second, everything will change. But unfortunately, on that moment, the president of our country, I don't know how, he decided to leave his own country. When he left, when he escaped from his own responsibility, everything changed 180 degrees. To be honest, in front of my eyes, it was a massive, critical situation in Afghanistan. After that moment, I cannot, for 1, 2, 3 weeks, after that moment, I cannot sleep. I counted, I was there at the runway. I counted the people that fell down from C-17. Right now, I'm mentioning this, my body is air getting up, to be honest. When the people falling down from the aircraft, it's just, I counted until 12 when the aircraft fly from the airport. All the people, they are trying to attack to the airport to how to rescue their life. I decided to escape with my aircraft. But personally, I said no. I cannot leave my family to be under the control of the Taliban because before 2001, I had the experience of the Taliban. Taliban, their mentalities, I don't know how they are thinking. Always they are against all the value of our country, against the freedom of the woman. Because of my family, I decided no, I want to join with my family. I will make some way, some solution to go out of Afghanistan with my family. In the meantime, I decided to contact with my friend, the American pilot. He's living in San Antonio, Texas right now. I told him, we are in this situation, but everything went out of the control. What should we do? He said, just be patient, I will make some coordination for you. I was in contact with my family. They said, no, you are military. For you, there is no chance. the Taliban, if they took the control of all Afghanistan, we are sure they are making problem. Just yesterday, as I told my friend, yesterday they pushed the majority of Afghan military personnel they left behind in Afghanistan. Two of my closest friends, it's almost 2 years they left behind in Afghanistan. Kindly, they're hiding themselves from the searching of the Taliban. Finally, Taliban found them. They pushed them by force to fly. Yesterday, the flight, military personnel, especially pilots, they know if you have a space between your training, it's the requirement you have to have another training to be refreshed. If your mind is not refreshed, it's technology. You cannot handle everything. One emergency happened yesterday. I lost two of my closest friends. They were pilots. They left behind. They stuck in Afghanistan. Finally, everything went to the wrong direction. Right now, it's almost 2 years. All our nation is under the control of the Taliban. It is just a government, you're saying. It's like a jail. A lot of talents among the children in Afghanistan, they're just crying. With my family, with my relative, I'm in contact. They're graduated from high school. They're not allowed to go to university. No school, no university. All the women rights are stopped under the control of the dark regime of the Taliban right now. But finally, as I mentioned before, we are trying our best. But something is coming worse like this. The Taliban regime is like the COVID-19. For example, I'm telling you that it's in my mind it's coming like this. If I'm in a jungle, some wild animal is following me. I'm trying to attack the closest houses in the jungle. No matter he like it or he don't like it. I'm risking my life. For Afghanistan people, it happened like this. The wild regime come to Afghanistan. It is our nation right to risk their life. It is almost 2 years they are escaping from their own country. For me, I was not decided to be refugee, but the things happening like this, because of my life, I will do anything. Finally, we decided, I coordinated with my friend. He did very great job. Really, I'm appreciating from all that people, especially about the U.S. Air Force. We have a long experience, 10 years I work shoulder to shoulder with American military, American Air Force personnel in Afghanistan. We have a great experience in Afghanistan. But unfortunately, the situation had become upside down. Right now, we lost everything. My friend, he did very good, nice coordination. He made a plan. He invited me in somehow in some corner of the airport. He supported me to enter to the airport. After the fourth day of Kabul fell, I entered to the airport from Afghanistan in the evacuation process. I came to Azerbaijan, from Azerbaijan to Slovakia. I was nominated to be C-130 aircraft pilot for upgrade training. After the Taliban took the control of Afghanistan, I did 2 months my training. I was expected maybe somehow they will find the world, the US government or the United Nations, they will find some solution for Taliban to change their mentality to serve for their people. But unfortunately, Taliban, they are not changing. Their mind is like stone. They're thinking just you're right, everybody is wrong. With this kind of, with the neglect people, you cannot negotiate it. You cannot talk. You cannot discussion. You just skip from that kind of people. But finally, after 70 days from Slovakia, I come from Slovakia to Virginia. In the Virginia, there was a military camp. I was not expected the things coming like this in my life. In a one small tent, we were just 48 person just in a small tent. There was not enough space to sleep, actually. It was a heavy rain. I will never forget that. I talked with my friend. I told him, it is better to die with my family, in my own country, instead of having life like this, just living in this sleeping in the stone. To be honest, they did very, very great job. 30,000 people was there on that military base. But after 1-2 nights, they handle everything. We find bed, we find food, clothes, everything. They provide everything. We came here. As I mentioned, the things are happening like this. Right now, it's a new phase. We cannot control the refugee. It's a long journey. In 2021, it happened for Afghanistan. 2022, it happened for Ukraine. For future, no can guarantee what will happen. Maybe it will happen, I hope not, for another countries. The people are coming. We have to, as a human, we have this responsibility, and instead of blaming or complaining, we have responsibility to understand each other, support each other, and help each other. Right now, bunch of people, they came from Afghanistan. As doctor mentioned, we have a lot of gaps. The important gaps, it is our responsibility to fill that. It is to educate them. Personally, according to my experience, I don't know what is the reason. Unfortunately, Afghanistan geopolitical location is because of that or because of another reason. I born in a war, I grew up in a war. Finally, I escaped in a war. I became a refugee because of war. Still, there is no guarantee. There is war in Afghanistan. And during the war, you cannot expect from the people, they have to know everything. They don't know because they are not educated. Being a military in the US, being in a military in Afghanistan, it's totally different. In US, they have chance to learn. They have a lot of good training program. They're training the soldiers. But in Afghanistan, because of the war, we don't have that chance. Just they know how to fight, that's it. They are not educated, they are illiterate. They are not able to write and read in their own language. The majority of people, they became refugees, they came from Afghanistan to US, especially to US. It is almost 2 years I'm in contact as a refugee. I'm working right now with the agency. I'm working with refugees. They are not educated. They don't know how to adjust their mind in this country. Right now, everything is on technology. They are not able to handle with technology. It's my last suggestion is for you guys, anywhere, in any organization you're working, just understand the refugee and try your best to fill that gap, the gap of education. And during my experience to working with Refugee Dream Center, they have really a lot of good program, but still it is not easy, just pure, all of us, we are 15, 17 staff that are working at the Refugee Dream Center. We need the help of the other organization. We need help of you guys to support us in this case. If we are not supporting each other, the people under the depression, you cannot expect from them to be nice. Maybe they will do something wrong. When the thing is going wrong, it's making problem for everybody. Thank you so much. You are paying attention from my experience. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much again to all four of our panelists. And now we'll open it up to discussion and questions from the audience. So please feel free to raise your hands and we can take questions.
Yeah, it's been a wonderful presentation and I'm very much impressed. So my name is Bernard. I'm a PhD student at Georgetown University, specifically looking at infectious diseases. And since this evacuation process borders also on health, I want to know specifically from two angles, both mental health and infectious diseases. I'm a bit biased towards infectious diseases. We know the long-term impact of stress, especially for people who have been uprooted from their culture into a new terrain. What plans or what measures are in place? And obviously, once they are alienated, the stress can really lead to something dramatic in future, now or even in future. What measures are in place to address the issue of stress? I know we talked about cultural awareness, but it didn't really come out what is being done about stress, dealing with stress. And then the other question is more of the international spread of diseases. I mean, infectious agents do not carry passports, but they move as people move. And so what are in place to handle like maybe screening or other spread of infection, both for the local population and those who are coming, like, yeah.
I don't know if this is on. Yeah. We'll see. Oh, yeah, it is on. Thank you, Alex. So I think that we can get more detail from Jonathan on the quarantining, and then from Omar on the question about stress. But I can start by saying yes, absolutely. And stress actually of a traumatic incident before an individual becomes a refugee can also have intergenerational effects. I'm sure, as you're aware, in that it can affect the structure of a family and how family members relate to one another. So it's not just the individual who went through the traumatic event, it can also ripple out. So that's one of the reasons that we wanted to include the mental health screener portion of the project. And I'll turn it over to Omar to talk a little bit more about the mental health resources that exist, and also this is his area of expertise.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Alexandria. I think what people fail to understand is they think when people are evacuated, once you come to the US, everything is fine. But people receive a lot of information when they come in, and everything may be checkmarked, done. But after the honeymoon again is over, the information is overwhelming, people cannot absorb it all. And secondly, the honeymoon gets over, then the issue of isolation and the past traumatic experiences come back, and people it just explodes in a way. And there was a study in 2012, I think by the CDC, that indicated that the rate of suicide among refugees in the US is twice the national average. And that was because, one, there was copycat effect. Two, because people did not understand how to address their traumatic experiences. And three is because the interpretation of what mental illness is different from what the Western world would interpret it as. Somebody may interpret it as a cast of a spell from an enemy or demons catching you, and then it just gets reduced to a word, in quote, crazy. And nobody wants to be associated with that word in many parts of the world because of the culture and the stigma it carries. So we realized two main problems here in accessing mental health. One is access, and the other is stigma, which is all related to culture. And so what we do at the Dream Center, we do initial assessments, because our office is literally, this room here divided into different spaces is very small. So we don't have the capacity to even employ somebody full-time to work with us there to be doing clinical work. So we do initial assessments using tools such like, the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire is very long. It will be a more comprehensive way of assessing trauma and PTSD. But we use a short tool called CHRHS 15, Refugee Health Screener 15, which has 15 questions. It assesses you have immediate assessment of PTSD, depression, and anxiety, but it is not enough to give you really the whole picture, but it's enough to get somebody to be positive or negative, and then to refer for services. So what we do at the center, when somebody is assessed and is positive, we get them into a group. Actually, almost all refugees that come to the center, but those we spend more time on in didactic groups like women's groups or other forms of groups, youth groups. We have domestic violence prevention groups for adults, for men, women, but also for youth. Really just those kinds of didactic psychosocial groups. And beyond that, we do referrals, mostly to Quality Behavioral Health, which is in Warwick. I used to work there when I was interning for my clinical work. And what they have really really good work going on, especially for veterans of war, and now they're expanding into refugees. And I've done trainings with them in the past to ensure that they understand how to work with this population. But beyond that, from a visionary perspective, that is not enough. And I'm happy the state is here, the Department of Health, the State Department of Human Services, because our vision at the Refugee Dream Center is eventually to really launch a clinic. That's why personally I went to 5 years to work to school to study psychology, because I wanted to make sure this is part of the vision that we must have. There must be a health center within the Refugee Dream Center to ensure that we do this clinical work. It is not enough. That is just my answer in short. The whole thing is not the best. Yeah.
I'll add just briefly two pieces. One, on the mental health side, we recognize that being a challenge both for the evacuees and for the supporters. And for the evacuees, sometimes some of the small things we could do to help decrease some of those stress and to give a little bit of surety helped. So for instance, in my own location, there was not cell phone signal, right? And I can unpack this. Long story short, we found ways to get cell phone signal there and charging stations so they can contact their family, which may have been in Afghanistan, may have been in another country, may have been somewhere else in the United States, to say that we're okay, right? And so little things like that mattered. The giving agency, which I referred to earlier, and without unpacking all of it, like it gave them a bit of a surety as to things were moving rather than not communicating, right? And so dealing with the trauma, difficult. Dealing with just day-to-day stress, like we could do something about that. And the last I'll say is both education and fun. We found ways of doing both of those during their time, because we couldn't necessarily control how long it was going to be that they were with us, right? But we could do things like starting education process, starting to have fun, putting on movies on the side of those tents, for instance, like just little things. Playing soccer, you saw some photos of that. And honestly, the same thing occurred with the supporters. Instead of the supporters seeing this as an us and them, or us or them, became us and them, and which is the reason why I showed you some of those photos, where we encouraged building bonds with, as we saw it, future Americans if they chose to do so, right? Rather than it seem like, well, this is just somebody who needs help, right? That's a very, very different thing. And then on the infectious diseases, there was a long review process, both at the lily pad locations that I referred to before, which prevented quite a bit of spread of things like measles and things like that, although it did delay some of the process for folks getting in. And then once they were at the location, we had medical support to include what we called an expeditionary medical squadron that has a Role 2 trauma facility and all of these other things that were incorporated, so we could address the acute needs. And then these interagencies that we worked with addressed the medical needs, so that we brought them up to what we would consider the United States standard of medical care, to include immunizations and things like that, which became the long pole in the tent, to use a colloquialism, of processing them on to resettlement. I hope that answers your question.
Actually, just to add quickly on the infectious disease, once they get here, beyond what they do in the military bases, but once refugees get here in the specific states or localities where they are, they go through a process of doing immunizations and vaccines. And literally, it's like a whole year of making your appointments with the primary care doctors to make sure that you comply with public health requirements. And at the end of the year, and refugees take that very serious, because after 1 year, your I-94, which is the document that refugees come with, translates into a green card. But to do that paperwork, you need to prove that you did comply with public health requirements. So we take it very, very serious. And then you have to go to the Department of Health, a civil surgeon have to sign over to make sure that everything was complied with, checked, and then you apply for the green card. So I mean, in many forms, it goes well. I think lead is one of the small problems. We don't know whether people come with lead or they get the lead here, but our guess is some come with it, but some also get it here. Lead paint, lead poisoning, yes.
Let's take just 2 or 3 final questions. Maybe we'll have 1, 2, and 3. And why don't you each kind of stand up, introduce yourselves, and say your question, and then the panel will answer them all together.
Thanks, Adam. I'm Jules Frost, and I work with the Australian Civil Military Centre. Great to be here. Thank you all for your wonderful contributions today, and particularly for you telling your very personal story. Thank you for that. I wanted to ask Jonathan, with what you've articulated as the challenges, they're not surprising, but at some level, I'm surprised I work with Australia Civil Military Center, but I'm American, that was the case as far as the lack of knowledge and awareness. And despite not being trained because you're a fighter versus a humanitarian, what now do you think will happen within the military in the US, given what you've learned and what you're articulating here today? Do we have, or do you know, is there different actions that are being taken to ensure that doesn't play itself out again in a domestic setting? Because I think we can learn from that. Thank you.
Next over here.
My name is Craig McLean. I'm an anesthesiologist at Boston Children's Hospital and the Institute of Social Changes School. So one comment, one question. You guys had talked about the mental health issues. I will just note that there is also among refugee populations, I have a colleague at Cornell that works a lot with this, tremendous increase incident of chronic pain syndromes, particularly in refugees that experience violence, and so that's another health aspect. My question is, once again, this is an amazing presentation with all these different pieces of the story, and I guess, Alexandria, this is more for you. You looked a lot at the experience of the refugees themselves, and I'm curious if anybody's done any work on the military personnel that actually were put in this situation, and Jonathan, to your point, not being trained for this, on what their experiences were and having to make these very difficult decisions on who to let in and who not to. Because I think, to your point, Jonathan, we have to not only look at who we're trying to help, but how we're trying to help them and how better to do that. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Great. And then the last one.
Hi, good morning, Lieutenant Commander Strand. I'm a naval aviator. Was invited here by Captain Brightman. So my question actually parlays directly into his. When I saw your picture of the overloaded C-17, I'm immediately thinking weight and balance. Holy cow, this is gonna be a problem. And then to your comment where you said it was on the goodness of military members allowing certain people to come in, immediately I'm thinking that's not how we operate, right? Where we follow orders and rules, procedures. So to that question that he brought up, what are we doing for the folks or the military members that are on the ground? Because that directly translates to who shows up in the United States as a refugee. They're handling the immediate crisis. Are we providing the right direction and guidance to those individuals to make sure that they're not relying on the goodness of their heart, but they actually have protocol that they can follow, so the aircraft safely take off and the right people are being led into the airport or to the facilities? Because I can see that as being traumatic, very traumatic and difficult, and we're not making the right decisions in those crises moments. Thank you.
That's great. Let's turn it to the panel. I don't know, Jonathan, if you want to start, and then maybe Alexandria, and then we can allow Sadeqi and Omar to have some final words too.
Sure, absolutely. To the first question, Jules, thanks. I would say that you break this into two portions. One, there's the policy solutions, right, that we all desire. Right, and then there's the real world things that we all can do, the day-to-day actions. On the policy solutions front, we reference a bit of this in the report. Certainly the Inspector General investigations that for different agencies are looking into this, some of which are already released, some of the standard bureaucracy take forever, right? And many of them have identified this same gap that we're talking about to an extent, but not necessarily the solution, which is why we put forward in the report the recommendation of changing a current structure and a current framework and doing better with that framework as far as how we interact. The in-between step is each of your organizations in the areas that you operate in have the opportunity to develop template memorandums of understanding for those individuals that may operate with you, no matter what that is, but civil or otherwise. And there are templates that are now available for what we did recently in the past couple of years. So using those to get some ideas, that's incumbent upon each of us as leaders of different organizations. And we can do that without a policy necessary to say, hey, look, this is an idea, I think we should start here. Third, and probably the most important, no matter where you find yourself operating, you have it incumbent upon you to do your best to find out who's operating in and around you and start to build a trusting relationship with that. And there is no one that you must ask to say hello to someone else and start building a relationship. Maybe a little different if you know, if you are committing your organization to something, right? But I tend to operate by the idea that you never have to ask permission to do the right thing. And the right thing is for you to start finding out who's in and around you, who's working around you, and what possibilities do you have in the future of doing that best. Do you want me to hit the other questions briefly, or do you want me to move on, open that up? Yeah.
Thank you from your question. In my experience, as you mentioned about weight and balance, every day we are doing that. But how we are training, how they trained us, that things are happening like this, it's kind of different. For example, for 20 years, one guy, he's starting to become a doctor. When he really become a doctor in the hospital, he's facing with a total new things, new disease. In our mission as a military, the things are happening like this. It's kindly over all the standard procedure we have, over all of our safety procedure, especially in Afghanistan, the evacuation process for US Air Force. To be honest, it was not according all the rule and regulation, the procedure they are following that. It was something magically they did. They created some perfect system to do this magic job, to be honest. It was over all the standard they are following them. And, I was, according my experience, when 1-2 passenger or different, or we were struggling, it's not according our procedure, it is not fitting with my weight and balance. I saw the situation, what happened in Afghanistan, how the US Air Force military people, they handle that. Right now I changed my mind, but we have to think that something happening like this. We need to be ready, how to fight, how to handle, how to solve this kind of problem.
I'm going to add just a little bit to that. And it's important to realize, and this is unpacked a little further in the report, that the military, the Department of Defense, was planning for an evacuation operations within Afghanistan. We can't just do it ourselves, right? We have to wait until another organization, in this case the Department of State, asks for help, and they did in the middle of July, and they said, oh, we would like you to evacuate 3,500 people. Yes, no problem, you can do that, right? So when you look at the report and our particular recommendations of this, it actually goes back higher in that we need to plan for much more worst-case scenarios to allow, much like Sadeqi talked about right up there, allow us to plan for the worst case. Allow us to see who we need to contact and the relationships that need to be built, rather than have a secret or wait until things went off the rails in the particular case here, where all you're doing is reacting to contact, to use our language, and reacting to that critical situation. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's a problem with the way that we plan. I think there's a problem with the way that we build relationship and the way that we care about what could possibly happen. And that crew, by the way, they knew their aircraft, they knew the weights that go with it. I mean, we've got a C-17 pilot, you can talk to him, he's in uniform about it. Like, they're probably, even though the policy said don't put this many people on there, he's probably sure that his aircraft could handle that.
Sorry for jumping on this. Even we have limitation, all the crew always you're keeping a space for yourself for something happening like this. Secretly you're keeping for yourself. It's not the things you have to share with everybody. You have to keep for yourself. Something happen, you have to handle it. That's it.
Speaking military language now.
And I'll just hit one last point to your question over there about things that we've done for the personnel. The military has gotten better. The military has gotten better at understanding that you also need to support the supporter. Within the evacuation operation, so the Operation Allies Refuge, they specifically created a couple of teams that they would send around to the different lily pad locations, right, that were specific for the mental health and the spiritual health and the concerns, medical health of those that were doing the operation. that is in addition to supporting those being evacuated. So in this particular case, on the back of a C-130 that was owned by the environment, they had at least 1 or 2 chaplains that went, a couple of mental health counselors, a logistician who could then go, oh, what is the needs? Let me help you address those particular needs, right? Because maybe the individual is just feeling a bunch of stress because all they really want to do is provide internet for their evacuees, right? And they needed a way to do that. So the long-term health, so that's the acute. The long-term health, well, I think that's where all of us try to stay engaged on seeing this problem through. And rather than thinking that our country, our nation, the international community has addressed this problem and has now moved on, we want to see these good news stories. I want to see a great news story for Sadeqi's family to be here in the United States with him and reunited. And that would give me great help to know that even though I didn't do everything right, we did a few things right.
All right, well,
There was a question around military, study on military.
Oh, yes, just a short answer to that question. So what Jonathan described as support to the supporters, not to my knowledge have there been extensive studies done on that aspect. Potential future research.
so I want to thank our panel as well, all together now. And we are going to break for lunch, which will be right here in the Agora. Again, at 1:30, please go to the breakout panels, either here or over at the main Watson building. Please also take the time to look at the posters. And I will just put a quick plug, as was mentioned before. This report is on our website currently. If you go to our website, watson.edu/CHRHS, you can click on programs, and in our civil military program, we have all of our recent reports there that you can read, including a big one that we just put out last week on civil military coordination during the COVID-19 pandemic. So please feel free to read those as well. Thank you, everybody.